It was early morning in Jerusalem, and the temple courts were beginning to fill with those hungry for teaching. The sun had barely broken through the sky, casting soft light on stone pathways and the quiet footsteps of those gathering around. Jesus, what began as an ordinary moment of learning, quickly unraveled into a public spectacle. A woman, disheveled and terrified, was dragged forward by a group of men, religious leaders, her shame exposed, her sin announced, her fate seemingly sealed. She had been caught in adultery, and they made sure everyone knew it. The noise of accusation echoed through the open space, and all eyes turned to the one person who might decide what would happen next. They came to trap him, not just to see how he would respond to her sin, but to force him into an impossible dilemma. If he condemned her, he would violate the mercy he preached. If he excused her, he would disregard the law of Moses. Either way, he would lose. But Jesus, as always, did not move according to their rules. He did not play their games. He did something none of them expected. He bent down and began to write in the sand. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged with meaning. Every breath held tension. The men waited for his voice, but he gave them something more unsettling, a pause. The woman said nothing. She had no defense, no plea, no hope. And yet, she was not alone. Jesus had not left. He was near. His presence did not recoil from her guilt. It remained with her in it. That presence, unhurried and deliberate, began to shift the atmosphere. What he wrote remains unknown. The gospel does not record the content, only the act. But perhaps that mystery is part of the message. The words may have vanished, swept away by breeze of footsteps, but the impact has endured. Sometimes it is not what is said aloud that changes us, but what is whispered into the soil of our soul, quietly, gently, in the most fragile places. And in that holy silence, truth was already doing its work. This was no ordinary moment. It was a collision between law and grace, between human condemnation and divine mercy. And at the center of it stood a woman the world was ready to discard, and a Savior who saw her not as a lesson, not as an example, but as a person worthy of compassion. Before anything else was said, he gave her the gift of space. Space to breathe, space to be seen, space to hope again. And maybe that's exactly what we need too. In the noise of judgment, in the rush to label and correct, we need that pause, that divine stillness, that bending low to the dust where we've fallen, not to leave us there, but to meet us there. To remind us that mercy does not begin when we are clean, it begins when we are caught. If messages like this speak to your heart, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss future videos. Like the video if it encouraged you, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if someone you care about needs to hear this today, send it their way. You never know what a quiet moment of truth might do in their life. No one in the temple that morning could have guessed the ancient echoes that were unfolding before their eyes. As Jesus stooped to write in the dust, the image may have appeared simple, even strange, but within that quiet act, history itself was being remembered and rewritten. The finger that moved across the earth was not just offering a response to the accusers. It was reaching back across centuries, all the way to Mount Sinai, where fire and cloud had once met the trembling of human hearts. On that mountain, long before this woman's shame and the crowd's judgment, another finger had written. Exodus 31 verse 18 tells us that God gave Moses the tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Those commandments, carved into the unyielding rock, came down from the heights of divine holiness and met a people who were still learning what it meant to walk in obedience and reverence. The law was perfect. It reflected the heart of God, just, righteous, pure, but it also revealed how far humanity had fallen. For every word etched into stone, there was an echo of failure in the hearts of those who heard it. Now, centuries later, that same divine finger moved once more, but it did not carve into stone this time. It traced lines in the sand on the ground of the temple, where the dust of humanity gathered beneath the feet of sinners and saints alike. The shift was unmistakable. It was no longer about commandments etched in granite. It was about grace written in the earth, where it could be seen yet not preserved, known but not captured, felt but not codified. This moment was not about dismissing the law. Jesus did not cast it aside. He fulfilled it, not by wielding its power to condemn, but by revealing its true purpose, to lead people not into death, but into life. Romans 10 verse 4 says, "Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." And in that temple court, the living embodiment of the law stooped low, not to crush, but to lift. It is easy to miss the weight of what Jesus was doing. The religious leaders had brought the woman forward under the full authority of Moses. They knew the letter of the law. They could quote it, enforce it, use it. But they had not grasped its heart. They had taken a gift given to guide and turned it into a weapon designed to wound. And so Jesus, who had spoken the world into existence and whose hands shaped humanity from dust, now returned to that dust, not to destroy, but to redeem. Writing in sand is a fleeting act. The wind can erase it, the next step can blur it. And yet, it is in that fragility that something beautiful emerges. The permanence of stone carries the weight of finality. But sand, soft, shifting, responsive, allows for new beginnings. This was no accident. Jesus chose the ground beneath their feet to write his response. Not a scroll, not a stone, but earth. The same earth into which God had once breathed life. By doing this, Jesus was showing that the conversation had changed. Where once judgment stood engraved in stone, now mercy moved gently across dust. It was not a contradiction of the law, but a fulfillment of its deepest longing, that humanity would not remain enslaved to sin, but would walk freely in the light of love. The scribes and Pharisees wanted to trap Jesus between law and love, to force him into a corner where upholding one meant abandoning the other. But Jesus, with infinite wisdom and compassion, revealed that true justice and mercy are never at odds. In fact, they meet perfectly in him. This image of the divine finger writing again, this time on sand, brings a profound invitation to reflection. If the commandments were once carved on cold, immovable stone, and now traced gently across dust, what does that say about the heart of God? Perhaps it reveals that he does not seek to inscribe judgment into our lives with unchangeable severity, but to write truth tenderly where it can be received. Perhaps it means that the law was always meant to lead us towards something greater, a person, not just a principle. Jesus writing in the sand reminds us that God still speaks into the places we least expect. Not from the mountaintop only, but in the midst of human mess and brokenness. Not with a shout from heaven, but with silence that speaks more than words. And that finger, once used to carve boundaries, now moves with grace to draw lines that cannot be erased by stones thrown in anger. This is the shift that changes everything. From condemnation to compassion, from demands to deliverance, from punishment to possibility. The very finger that once wrote rules now reveals mercy, not in a thunderous declaration, but in a quiet moment that reached back to Sinai and forward into eternity. The hush that lingered over the temple courts was not born of confusion, it was born of awe. Those who had come thirsting for confrontation now found themselves frozen, not by fear, but by something far more penetrating. The moment had slipped beyond the reach of debate. It now belonged to a deeper realm, where words failed and wonder took hold. All eyes remained on the ground, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been written. And yet, no one could say with certainty what that writing was. The Gospel of John is deliberately silent on the matter. The evangelist, known for his poetic restraint, leaves it unsaid, as though the absence of detail is itself an invitation. An open space for every reader, every seeker, every heart carrying questions too heavy to voice. Perhaps that is the point. By not recording the words, Scripture beckons us to lean in closer, to ask not merely what Jesus wrote then, but what he still writes now. Some have suggested that Jesus was writing the sins of the accusers, that as each man stood ready with stone in hand, the dust beneath revealed the darkness within. Perhaps names were listed beside transgressions, hidden deeds, secret betrayals, private shamas laid bare not for the crowd, but for individual conscience. It would explain their unease, their silence, their gradual retreat. If this interpretation holds truth, it was not the voice of Jesus that condemned them. It was the quiet confrontation of their own reflection. The Word made flesh had bent to the earth, and in doing so, turned the mirror back on those who had come to expose another. Others believe he wrote Scripture itself, passages from the law they so proudly upheld, now wielded not as defense, but as exposure. Some point to Jeremiah 17 verse 13, which speaks hauntingly, "Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water." Imagine the weight of those words traced into the ground, confronting men who had claimed loyalty to God while their hearts remained far from Him. Scripture, when spoken aloud, can be debated, but when written silently in dust, it holds a power that penetrates the soul before the mind has time to argue. And then there are those who wonder if it was names he wrote, names of people known only to him. Maybe the woman's name, gently traced, restoring her dignity before any verdict was given. Maybe the names of the men around her, not in judgment, but in recognition. A reminder that he saw them too, not just their outward zeal, but their inward need. He knew them, as he knows every person who has ever stood with stone in hand or shame in heart. Some suggest that the writing was not for the crowd at all, that it was a private message, meant only for the woman, something only she could see and understand. Perhaps a word that pierced through her terror and shame, telling her that she was not forgotten, that she was more than the worst thing she had done. That mercy had come, not with a sword, but with a finger writing hope in the dust. The beauty of this mystery is not in finding a single answer, but in allowing the silence to speak. The absence of recorded words does not diminish the moment, it deepens it. It allows the scene to live, not as a historical detail frozen in time, but as a divine gesture that continues to move. Because what Jesus wrote may have vanished from the ground, but the impact was eternal, and perhaps that is what matters most. Jesus writes, not for preservation on tablets or scrolls, but for transformation in the soul. What he traced in that dust, he continues to write today, not in places that wind and footsteps can erase, but in the hidden chambers of the heart. He writes in silence, he writes in mercy. He writes in places no one else sees, where fear has built walls and shame has taken root. And when he writes, it is never accidental. Every mark is deliberate, every gesture filled with meaning. He does not scribble, he inscribes. For those watching him that day, the sand was temporary, but the moment was eternal. It revealed a God who does not thunder every truth aloud, but whispers grace in places so humble, they're easy to miss. Dust is not strong, it is easily disturbed. But it is also where man came from. Genesis reminds us that from the dust of the earth, God formed life. And here again, in the dust, Jesus begins to form something new, not just for the woman, but for every person who watches and wonders what he might be writing in the dust of their own life. To sit with this question, what did he write, is to invite the Spirit to speak in the quiet. It is to admit that sometimes the most sacred messages are not those shouted from pulpits, but those gently traced in the moments when we are at our lowest. What he wrote then may be hidden from our eyes, but the invitation is not. He writes still, in our weakness, in our searching. In the dust we try to sweep away and the places we would rather forget. He kneels beside us, not to accuse, but to reveal. Not to shame, but to awaken. The moment hung thick in the air, stretched by tension and silence, when Jesus finally rose from his writing. Dust still clung to his fingers, the ground marked with mysteries that no wind could fully erase from memory. The crowd stood frozen, hearts bracing for an answer, expecting judgment or a clever rebuttal. But instead of entering into their trap, instead of engaging in legal intricacies or defending the accused, Jesus spoke a single sentence that fractured the very foundation of their authority. "Let the one without sin cast the first stone." He did not shout. He did not debate. He simply spoke, words as precise as a blade, yet as weighty as a mountain. In that brief utterance, the tables turned. The accusers, moments ago bold in their self-righteous fury, now found themselves staring into the mirror of their own hearts. The target of the crowd had been the woman, but with that one statement, the spotlight shifted. Jesus had not dismissed the law nor ignored the offense. Instead, he had aimed the law back where it was always meant to point, not just at others, but inward, toward the soul of the one holding the stone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric, pulsing with realization. Those 5 words did what no argument could. They exposed. They reached beyond outward behavior and pierced into hidden thoughts, secret longings, forgotten failings. The men who had arrived with certainty now stood confronted by something far more dangerous than public shame, private truth. This was not a clever maneuver. It was a divine diagnosis. Jesus did not dismantle their trap with cunning, but with clarity. His words did not attempt to negotiate or defend. They simply revealed. And that is the nature of holy truth. It does not require volume or spectacle. It does not clamor for dominance. It only needs to be spoken. Because when divine truth meets human pride, it does not argue, it convicts. Each person in the crowd heard the same words, but the impact was personal. The sentence echoed through minds layered with memories and hidden sins. No one was exempt, no one untouched. And though no stones had yet been thrown, the weight of them suddenly grew heavier. They did not feel like tools of justice anymore. They felt like burdens, cold reminders of the judgment they had long reserved for others, but had never applied to themselves. What Jesus did in that instant was not simply to call out hypocrisy. He dismantled the illusion of moral superiority. He made clear that the only one truly qualified to condemn stood among them without a stone in his hand. He, the one who knew no sin, refused to play their game. He did not distance himself from the woman's sin. He refused to distance himself from her humanity. This statement, so brief yet so piercing, did more than silence a crowd. It unmasked them. It left no room to hide. Because once you are faced with the condition of your own soul, the desire to punish another starts to dissolve. When the eyes are open to one's own failures, one's grip on judgment begins to loosen. And the question that hovered then still echoes now: are we holding stones? Perhaps not literally, but in our words, in our thoughts, in our quick judgments and quiet condemnations. Do we not also stand among that crowd, pointing fingers, hoping to distance ourselves from the shame of others by exposing it? It is so much easier to see the sin in someone else's life than to face the fractures in our own. So much easier to take refuge in what we have not done than to reckon with what we have left undone. But the voice of Jesus still breaks into that self-made righteousness, still speaks into the courtroom of every human heart with the same unshakable truth. Let the one without sin cast the first stone. This sentence doesn't just hold up a mirror to the accusers, it holds one up to us. And in that reflection, we are invited not to despair, but to awaken. Because the conviction it brings is not meant to destroy us. It is meant to free us from the illusion that we are better than others, from the chains of comparison, from the poison of unforgiveness. It is no coincidence that Jesus did not follow his statement with accusation. He did not proceed to list the sins of each man. He simply let the words hang in the air, giving space for the heart to respond. He trusted that those with ears to hear would not need more explanation. And so too today, his words still require no commentary, only honesty. Are we ready to drop the stones we hold? Not just the ones we raise in anger, but the ones we cling to for security. Stones of judgment, stones of pride, stones we throw with our silence, our sarcasm, our assumptions. Jesus speaks not to silence debate, but to invite transformation. And he speaks still, not only to the crowd around that woman, but to every heart that still finds itself in the middle of judgment and grace. No sound marked their retreat. No declarations of defeat, no cries of apology, no justification for their silence. Just footsteps, uneven, hesitant, fading into the distance. The stones that had moments before seemed so heavy with purpose were now weightless, abandoned, scattered across the temple floor like broken intentions. And they left not all at once, but slowly, in a quiet procession of hearts undone, not by force, not by humiliation, but by the undeniable pressure of truth gently applied. The text tells us they departed beginning with the oldest. Perhaps age had softened the edges of certainty. Perhaps the years had made them more aware of how easily righteousness can become a mask rather than a mirror. The older ones, having lived longer, had seen more, made more mistakes, hidden more secrets, buried more regrets. The words of Jesus, echoing through that sacred space, stirred memories too personal to ignore. Memories that no law could cover, no ritual could erase. Conviction, unlike condemnation, does not demand submission. It invites reflection. It does not strike like a whip, but unfolds like a dawn, exposing what had long been hidden in shadow. In that temple court, it was not shame that drove the accusers away, it was clarity. The clarity of knowing, perhaps for the first time, that righteousness was not theirs to wield like a sword, but a grace they too needed to receive. The youngest followed, more slowly perhaps, reluctant to release the momentum of the crowd. But truth does not require maturity to be heard, it only requires humility. And humility, even when resisted, finds its way into the heart when silence is allowed to speak louder than pride. One by one, they turned away, not because they were defeated in argument, but because their souls had been addressed in a way no argument ever could. Jesus did not call out their names. He did not list their failures. He did not ask them to explain their motives. He simply stood there, unshaken, after stooping to the dust, and let truth do what it was always meant to do, shine. This moment reveals a holy paradox, that the most powerful form of confrontation is often the gentlest. No raised voice, no dramatic pronouncement, just presence. Divine presence that sees through every layer, every defense, every mask. The presence of Jesus alone, paired with one sentence and a gesture in the dust, unraveled years of self-justification. And isn't that the nature of conviction when it truly comes from God? It does not crush, it awakens. It does not humiliate, it liberates. It calls the soul not to despair, but to return. Psalm 51 verse 17 says, "A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise." In that temple court, surrounded by the weight of human judgment, divine mercy had made space for broken hearts to walk away, not in disgrace, but with a door left open. Some may have walked away confused. Some may have felt anger rising in the place of repentance. But the opportunity was there for each of them. Not just to drop their stones, but to drop the stories they had told themselves for years, the stories that kept them insulated from compassion, from grace, from transformation. And though the scene narrowed, though the crowd thinned, the message expanded. What happened in that moment was not just about a woman caught in adultery. It was about every person who has ever stood with a stone in hand, convinced of their own rightness, blind to their own need. It was about those who used the law to protect themselves from their own vulnerability. And it was about what happens when Jesus shows up and gently unveils what we'd rather keep buried. He could have sent them away with thunder. He could have leveled them with supernatural revelation. But instead, he allowed them the dignity of walking away under the quiet weight of personal conviction. He didn't push. He simply made it impossible for them to stand where they had been standing, without acknowledging the ground had shifted beneath their feet. And perhaps that is one of the greatest mercies of God, not that he proves us wrong with force, but that he gives us the chance to see it ourselves, to feel it, and to respond not out of fear, but out of truth. Conviction is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of freedom. But it starts with leaving behind what we thought we needed, leaving the stone, the certainty, the pride, and walking away, step by step, into something far more honest. A stillness had settled over the temple courts, not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that follows revelation. The crowd was gone, their footsteps swallowed by the city beyond the temple walls. The tension that once charged the air like a storm cloud had lifted. What remained was something altogether different, quiet, sacred, unshakable. At the center of it stood Jesus, and at his feet, a woman still caught between shame and wonder. She had braced herself for death. From the moment she had been dragged through the streets and thrown into the center of the crowd, her fate had seemed sealed. The humiliation was unbearable. The verdict seemed inevitable. She had been spoken about, pointed at, used as a symbol of sin, and yet no one had spoken to her. Not until now. Jesus turns to her, not to question, not to accuse, but to ask, "Woman, where are your accusers?" It is not a rhetorical question. It is an invitation to see what has changed, not just around her, but within her. The ones who had used her story as a trap were gone. The men who had declared her guilty without trial had disappeared. The circle of condemnation had been broken. And now, in the place of noise, there was voice. A voice that did not demand an answer, but opened a door. She looks up. Her eyes, which had searched only for mercy and found none among the crowd, now meet the only eyes that truly matter. And those eyes do not burn with disappointment. They do not scan her like a ledger of failures. They look at her, not through her, not beyond her, but at her, as if she is worth seeing. This is the turning point, not just in her story, but in every story that has ever been burdened by guilt. Jesus does not begin by reminding her of what she has done. He begins by reminding her of what no longer remains. The voices of condemnation have vanished. The sentence expected never came. And all that is left is a question that quietly uncovers the truth. She is no longer accused. In that moment, she is no longer defined by what was done in secret or what was shouted in public. She is not reduced to her failure or frozen in her past. She is standing in the presence of the only one who had the right to condemn, and he chooses not to. This is grace. Not a vague feeling or a general kindness, but a direct encounter with a love that names us, lifts us, and makes us new. It does not ignore what has happened. It simply chooses to answer it with mercy instead of punishment. Grace does not speak over us. It speaks to us. It meets us when the dust still clings to our skin, when the shame is still raw, when we expect rejection and find, instead, compassion. It steps into the most vulnerable places and restores what judgment tried to destroy: dignity, identity, hope. She remains. That detail matters. The accusers left. But she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because something in her knew that what stood before her was different. This was not a teacher of the law. This was not another judge. This was someone who had seen everything and had not turned away. When Jesus speaks to her, he calls her woman. A word of respect, not distance. The same word he used when speaking to his own mother. In that one address, he returns to her what had been stripped away by the crowd: her value, her humanity, her place. The question he asks, "Where are your accusers?" is more than an observation. It is a declaration. They are gone. The ones who had made her sin their spectacle now have no voice here. Their absence is not accidental. It is evidence. Evidence that grace is stronger than guilt. That mercy holds more weight than accusation. And still, Jesus does not rush to resolution. He gives her space to see what has changed, to recognize the new atmosphere she stands in. The space once filled with judgment is now filled with possibility. The ground where she once trembled is now holy with presence, with peace. It is not enough to be spared. What Jesus offers her is not mere survival, it is restoration. He does not simply protect her from condemnation. He reminds her that she is more than what she has done, that she is seen, known, and worth saving. This is what grace always does. It does not simply erase the past, it reclaims the person. It speaks into the silence left behind when every accusing voice falls away and says, "You are still here, and that means there is still hope." Grace never arrives late. It enters precisely when the soul is most ready to hear it, not when all is cleaned up and perfected, but when all feels lost. That is when the voice of Jesus comes, asking not what we deserve, but whether we can see that the accusers are gone. And even if the world tries to remind us of who we were, even if the voice of shame tries to rise again in memory or fear, the question of Jesus remains louder, clearer. Where are your accusers? Because when mercy stands beside you, no other voice holds authority. The dust had barely settled beneath her feet, yet something within her had already shifted. She had come into the temple expecting condemnation, expecting the finality of judgment to fall like a stone. And now, standing face to face with the one man who held the right to cast it, she hears words that reshape the very fabric of her future. Go and sin no more. This was not a reprimand dressed in polite language. It was not a warning laced with disappointment. It was a release, a sending forth, a declaration that her story was not over, but being rewritten from this moment forward. And it came not from a place of control, but from a place of love so pure, so unshakably holy, that it could see her not for what she had done, but for what she was now becoming. Those 6 words carried no trace of threat. They were not spoken to chain her with fear, but to free her with possibility. Jesus was not saying, "Earn your pardon." He was saying, "You have been set free, now live in that freedom." Because real mercy is never passive. It is not a soft blanket that merely covers what is broken. It is a fire that refines, a river that cleanses, a force that sets in motion the process of becoming whole. Mercy does not pretend sin never happened. It acknowledges it fully and still offers something greater. In telling her to go, Jesus returned to her what shame had tried to steal: movement. She was no longer paralyzed by fear, no longer stuck in a moment defined by failure. She was not sentenced to remain under the weight of what had been. She was sent forward into what could be. And in telling her to sin no more, he was not expecting perfection overnight. He was calling her into a new identity, one that could only be received, not achieved. That's the mystery and the power of grace. It does not say, "Change, and then you'll be loved." It says, "You are loved, now walk in that love and let it change you." Sign had marked her, the law had condemned her, the crowd had dehumanized her. But Jesus did something no one else had even thought to do. He restored her. Not just to society, not just to safety, but to the possibility of transformation. He did not reduce her to her past. He called her into her purpose. Forgiveness, when it comes from God, never leaves us where it found us. It picks us up. It redirects our steps. It redefines what we think is possible. And so when Jesus said, "Go and sin no more," it was not an impossible standard to measure her failure against. It was a door opening toward a life no longer ruled by shame, but led by love. There's something deeply tender in how Jesus balances truth and mercy here. He does not dismiss sin. He does not redefine it or soften its weight. But he also does not let it have the final word. He names it and then lifts her above it. He acknowledges its reality and then points her toward a future where it no longer controls her. This is the pattern of divine grace. Not avoidance, not excusing, but restoring. And this is where the weight of mercy becomes most real. Because when someone who knows everything about you, every secret, every failure, every motive, looks you in the eye and offers you a new beginning, that mercy becomes a fire in the soul. It doesn't leave you comfortable in compromise. It stirs you. It awakens you. It gives you the courage to step into a life that looks nothing like the one that almost destroyed you. Jesus was not sending her back to hide in the shadows. He was sending her forward into the light. He was telling her that her past no longer held authority over her identity, that the label others tried to stick to her soul had no weight in the presence of truth spoken by the one who made her. And that truth still speaks. Each time we encounter mercy that we did not earn, that we cannot repay, we are faced with the same invitation: go and sin no more. Not as a demand from a distant God, but as a whisper from the one who loves us too deeply to let us stay broken. He does not just forgive, he makes us new. He does not just erase the record, he writes a new story. Grace does not leave us passive, it compels a response. Not because we are afraid of losing it, but because we are overwhelmed by having received it. The gratitude it stirs becomes the fuel for transformation, not out of obligation, but out of awe. This kind of mercy does not pat us on the back and say, "Do your best." It wraps us in truth and says, "You are more than this. You are mine. Now walk like it." To every heart weighed down by failure, Jesus still speaks. Go, not as one rejected, but as one sent. Sin no more, not as an unreachable ideal, but as the fruit of a life touched by grace. This is not a law laid upon your back. It is a hand extended to your soul. The question is not whether we are worthy of this mercy. We are not. The question is what we will do with it. Long after the dust was disturbed and the crowd had dispersed, long after the words spoken that day ceased to echo within the temple courts, the deeper meaning of that encounter continued to move, like a quiet current beneath the surface of time. The sand may have been swept clean, the writing erased by wind or footsteps, but what Jesus did that morning was never meant to stay in the dust. It was meant to live on, in hearts, in stories, in lives transformed by mercy. Because he did not write only for them. He wrote for you too. The accusers are gone, but the message remains. A message that still finds its way to those burdened by failure, to those standing in the rubble of regret, to those who are weary of hiding, of striving, of fearing that if they were truly known, they would be cast aside, to those who feel forgotten, to those who feel like the story is over. Jesus still writes in the dust of our lives. He writes not with condemnation, but with compassion. Not with accusation, but with invitation. He writes in places we think are too far gone. In moments where shame tries to bury us. In memories we try to forget. And in every one of those places, his writing says the same thing. You are not condemned. You are not alone. You are seen. You are loved. You are free. The words may not be visible to others. They may not appear as sentences we can hold in our hands. But they are real as the mercy that met that woman in the temple. As real as the silence that followed the dropping of stones. As real as the look in his eyes when he said, "Where are your accusers?" That was not just a moment in history, it was a pattern for every generation to come. Because every one of us stands where she once stood, exposed, guilty, hoping for mercy. And every one of us is offered what she received, not because we have earned it, but because he delights to give it. He is still writing. In the places you think are too messy, in the wounds that haven't yet healed, in the choices you wish you could change, in the quiet, unseen corners of your heart where you wonder if grace could possibly reach. And every time he writes, he does so with the same hand that carved mountains and calmed storms, the same hand that stretched out on the cross not to punish, but to pardon. The message he wrote that day wasn't temporary. It wasn't limited to that dusty floor. It was a glimpse into the heart of God himself. A heart that bends low, that refuses to throw stones, that meets us at our worst and calls us toward our best. So when you ask what Jesus might be saying to you now, remember this. The message hasn't changed. You are not condemned. Not because your past wasn't real, but because his mercy is more real still. You are not forgotten. Not because you have been perfect, but because his love never needed your perfection. You are not hopeless, because the same voice that silenced accusers still speaks hope into broken places. He wrote for you too. so that when the noise of this world grows loud, when guilt whispers lies, when fear tells you that you'll never be enough, you can look to the dust where he once wrote and know that his truth still stands. Your story is not over, your worth is not lost, and your future is not held hostage by your past. If this message has spoken to your heart today, we invite you to respond in a simple way by helping it reach others who need to hear it too. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected with future messages rooted in grace and truth. Like the video so others can discover it more easily. Share it with someone in your life who may need this reminder. And leave a comment below to share how this touched your heart, or to encourage others who are walking their own journey of redemption. You never know whose story might begin to change, because you chose to share the one that changed yours.